Davis steps under center. Gibson and McClendon behind him. Davis with motion by Richard. Will give the ball to McClendon. He leaps. Oh, he doesn't get in. He fumbled the football. Carolina holds. The game is over. And Carolina has won the game.
Finley to throw. Over the middle, intercepted. Wolford again. Wolford the other way at the 30, the 40. Wolford to midfield. Miles Wolford with the pick. The Heels on the doorstep of an enormous victory.
Left side of the line. Hood standing to Williams' right. Williams gonna throw. One-on-one. Davis has it.
Touchdown. Carolina wins. Carolina is the Coastal Division champion.
Bernard fields it at the 26. Heading to the far side.
Gio at the 35. Gio is at the 50. No, he's not. Yes, he is. Gio is going to take it for a touchdown. Are you kidding me?
Connor Barth for the possible win. Snap, spot, kick away, high enough, long enough. It's good! It's good! Carolina has won the game on a 42-yard field goal by freshman Connor Barth. Good gosh, dirty!
This is the Heel Tough Blog Podcast. Hey guys, and welcome in to this edition of the Heel Tough Blog Podcast. It's Anthony Pagnotta back with you, and for the first time in a while, it is not going to be a quarantine interview. It is not going to be a recruiting podcast. We are here tonight to talk about, we're going to talk about the NFL Draft. We're also going to get into a little bit of the 2020 season for college football and what they're saying right now as in terms of if they're going to play the season. And we'll also kind of talk through what some of the alternate suggestions are if they're not able to play the season. So along with me, it is Josh Marlowe. First time in a while, buddy, that we've been on here. But I know I'm happy to talk a little bit of Tar Heel football, and glad you're able to be along with me to do it. How's the family holding up during this difficult time, man?
We're doing all right. A lot of sitting around, a lot of TV watching, a lot of beer drinking. Just trying to make the most of it as we can. Most importantly, just try and stay safe and stay healthy. So it's been a challenge, but after a month or so, I guess you could say we've fully adjusted to a new lifestyle.
So we went through a TV series. I feel like we can talk about this to start out the show. We went through Game of Thrones. You've done this before, and we went through it together. Ultimately, a fantastic show. So I do want to say thank you for pushing me into actually watching that series. And I feel like this is something that we should just throw out there because I feel like people may be looking for suggestions of things to watch. But yeah, I think that was ultimately a fantastic choice. What did you think the second time that you went through it? Do you think it was as good as the first time or better than the first time you went through it?
It didn't take me. I mean, the first day we started watching the show, we were hanging out together, and I immediately got rehooked a little bit quicker than the first time. I would probably say I loved it more because I realized a lot more stuff I didn't realize the first time going through it. Because as you learned, there's just so much going on at all times that it's easy to miss a thing or two here that shows up 10 episodes later.
Right.
But I already was prepared. And so, did okay. Phenomenal show. If you're into the medieval, if you like seeing blurry, gory death, suggest Game of Thrones 100%.
Oh, yeah, no. If you like death, that's the show for you. I feel like, from watching the show, I have my opinion of who should be on the Iron Throne. I think that it's kind of interesting if you want to make a comparison because this is a Tar Heel football podcast, and I don't know about you. I think Mack Brown would make a lot of sense as a ruler of the Iron Throne. I think that's pretty much what he's doing right now for the Tar Heels. He's doing such a great job of that, not only on the recruiting trail, but really putting a good group around him, a good small council around him in Chapel Hill. Do you think that Mack Brown would be a good Iron Throne, a ruler of the Seven Kingdoms?
Yeah, I mean, he relates to people. He's a good leader of men. He has that quality. He's not afraid to go into battle. Ultimately, he's going to do what's best for, and Game of Thrones Westeros, for us, it's Carolina football in the program. He's already done that in a year and a half or so on the job. So I do think if you put him in an alternate world, he would be successful as a ruler.
So, all right. So we've gone into our nerdiness here, and this is bound to happen with the fact that we're just going stir crazy sitting in the house with all this stuff going on. But the good news is that we actually got some sports to talk about over the last couple of days. We're not talking about the Last Dance documentary. We're all psyched because that's going to be on again tonight. And believe me, we've been talking about that on the Roy's Boys podcast, which you guys can check out on the Heel Tough Blog website, as well as the same apps that you listen to this podcast. There's the plug for that. But we got the NFL draft. It was pretty interesting. The first time that they've gone fully virtual. Got to hand it to Trey Wingo. He did a fantastic job, pretty much just handling the bulk of the hosting by himself. I mean, everybody there really did a great job. They really did a good job combining both staffs together to work for this, and it really had to happen with what happened to Todd McShay. But ultimately, what was your thoughts on the NFL draft and how they were able to do it virtually? I thought it went over pretty well, but some people had a different opinion.
You know me. I am not the biggest draft guy. And leading up to this draft, I had a lot of worries about how would this go, because you're putting NFL Network guys on an ESPN broadcast. How is the chemistry? How is that going to go? What you learned is that even though these guys may work for different networks and they have different opinions, they are the ultimate professionals at their jobs. Trey Wingo is, I've always considered, very underrated. I think he was a star this weekend. He did a very good job in the ESPN studio all by himself, leading us through 3 days of draft coverage, interacting with hosts and guests that he's never probably talked to before in his life, and did a fantastic job. And I think the NFL, because it got so much, I guess, talking points on Twitter, Facebook, all the social medias, they won't go away from the standard draft that they normally do whenever we get back to normalcy. But I do think you will see them become a lot more innovative in the draft moving forward. And as we know, Roger Goodell and the NFL, they're always trying to be innovative. This is another way for them to be like that.
Well, I wonder if a guy like Daniel Jeremiah maybe will be a guy that kind of splits the middle when it comes to draft coverage in the future. I kind of hope not, because I always like kind of the two draft broadcasts where you can kind of go watch one, that if you like it a little bit better, because they usually have a better lineup. I got to admit, really miss my guy Rich Eisen. Also wish that we would have gotten to hear a little more from another former Tar Heel, a guy that I think does a fantastic job, and not just because he's a former Tar Heel, because he knows and loves the draft, and Bucky Brooks. But I'm with you. I think they had a tough situation that they were faced with, which was, hosting an event that is huge every single year in and of itself. But you got to think, this year, this was really the first sports thing that we had that was any sort of live sports event in almost 2 months now? About a month and a half. So, I mean, you really got to hand it to them. I thought they handled it about as well as they could. I know there were some issues that a lot of people had with some of the production of it in terms of some of the stuff that was read on air. And I know that was one of those points that I kind of had a little bit of an issue with as well. And being someone that's in the field and, having to gone to school and kind of learn how people do these jobs, I just want people to realize that you should not be angry at Trey Wingo. You should not be angry at any of the guys that are on the telecast. They do not look up all those stats. That is done by somebody that is off camera that you don't see. That is handed to them. They read it off of a teleprompter or they read it off of a sheet of paper. That is not anything that Trey Wingo looks up and says, okay, we're just going to focus on this person's family history or whatever. I thought that was definitely a little bit controversial. Did you feel the same way with some of the stories that were that were apparently released without consent from some of the guys that got drafted?
I think that's where you got to draw the line. If the player and the family gives you the green light to go ahead and release some information or talk about an incident that was tragic in their life, I'm all for it. Well, I'm not saying I'm all for it, but you can understand, and it also makes you more appreciative, like, Javon Kinlaw growing up homeless, being a first-round pick. But when you're finding out guys that they didn't consent to this information being released, that's wrong. It's unprofessional, and I think you made a good point. You don't be mad at Trey Wingo or whoever. It's the people behind the scenes that you're not going to know their names. They're the ones that are feeding them that information, and then ultimately you blame ESPN and the producers because they're the ones that are saying, okay, we're going to do this. You need to check with the family, whatnot first. And so I know a lot of people made a lot of jokes about, how every time a kid got drafted, they had to talk about how their grandma or someone passed away. It wasn't that bad, but it just felt like every time they could force that into the broadcast, it'd be better if it wasn't always forced. It just it happened, and then you could kind of look at it in a different light.
Well, luckily, the two Tar Heels that were drafted, they did not have those anything that was released without their consent from what we know. Of course, they did focus very heavily on the fact that Charlie Heck had a brother, John Heck, who played at Carolina, as well as his dad, Andy, who, of course, is the offensive line coach for the Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs. Of course, you guys all know that. That was another real highlight that they seemed to love. They point out everybody in your family's occupation. There was one where they pointed out, a whole family. One was like a doctor, one was like a gym teacher, and everybody's kind of like, who really gives a damn? But luckily, the Tar Heel players, they didn't really succumb to that. Two Tar Heels get drafted. Of course, the first one, Charlie Heck, ends up going out to Houston, and I think this was a really good pick for both Houston, and this is a good fit for Charlie Heck, going to a team in Houston that really struggled to protect Deshaun Watson a year ago, and also is a team that just doesn't have a ton of offensive line depth. So I think Charlie Heck's going to have a real chance to go in there. It's going to take some time. That's why he's drafted in the 4th round, because he's got some things that he's got to clean up with his with some of the technical stuff. And there are some things that at his height are going to bother him against some of the shorter, squattier defensive ends. But ultimately, I felt like that was a pretty good destination for Charlie Heck. Did you kind of feel the same?
Yeah, I think you're going to a team that's going to be a playoff contender most likely. So you're gonna be around some talented dudes. So it's going to make you better if you get to have a training camp, some form of OTA, of course, preseason and regular season. A team that needs offensive linemen. What's the biggest thing we talk about when it comes to Houston? They can't protect Deshaun Watson, who we regard as one of the top 10 to 12 quarterbacks in the National Football League. You feel like a guy with that 6'7", all his versatility will be able to help in some capacity, but also there's not a whole lot expected of him right away. He can take a year or two to get adjusted to the NFL game, learn the system that Bill O'Brien and Houston run. So it's a quality spot. I never really thought of him going to Houston during the draft process, but like you said, really like the fit, and they're getting a heck of a player. That's all I know.
Oh, my God. So we've reached that point already here on the podcast where we've got to go to the puns. But you're right about that. Look, they allowed 49 sacks a year ago on their quarterbacks, 44 of them taken by Deshaun Watson, a guy that, remember, has had knee problems before. So ultimately, they're looking for a guy that is going to be able to help them keep the quarterback upright. And while Charlie Heck isn't the best run blocker, he was part of a line that helped two running backs go over 1,000 yards in terms of total offense this past year. So you definitely feel like he's going to be able to have some sort of role there in Houston in the next couple of years. Same thing with Jason Strowbridge, another guy. He gets drafted in the 5th round, 154 overall to the Miami Dolphins. And again, you don't think that he's going to come in there and immediately be able to start. You never really do know. That would be a pleasant surprise. But he ultimately ends up in another spot that I just really like for him. Brian Flores is coming in, in his 2nd year. Last year, came in very similar situation, I like to say, to Zach Taylor, where pretty much the goal was to be as bad as you possibly can because we've got to go find our future at quarterback. They've done that. They got Tua Tagovailoa. And now this is a team that's going to look to build, and it looks like Jason Strowbridge is one of those guys that's going to be in the plans for them on the defensive side of the football. The good news is there's a lot of new guys that are going to be coming through that door because of everything that Miami has done during last season and over the offseason, letting a lot of guys walk and bringing in some fresh faces. So for this staff, they're not going to really have an opinion on a lot of the guys that are coming in. So I think that really fits in well for Jason Strowbridge. He'll be in a 3-4 system, and I think there's a lot of things to like about this. And I know one of the things to like it has got to be the destination. I know you're probably feeling that way as well.
Yeah, I mean, he's going back home. He's from the state of Florida. You know, he's in a situation like you said, where Miami is in a total rebuild, so there's going to be a lot of opportunity for him to make an impact in year one. We heard Mac Brown say how many times during this year that he'll play his best football in the NFL. The best is still to go for him. And this was a guy that early on in Saturday entered Mel Kiper's top 10 board and hung around a little bit longer than I anticipated. I was one, if the Cowboys would have taken him, wouldn't have complained because he could do a lot of things that we need help on. But I do think he's in a good situation. Brian Flores showed last year that even though Miami gave away a lot of talent, he's capable of doing some stuff down there. And their rebuild, assuming that Tagovailoa pans out, is a little bit further than we probably anticipated. Strowbridge can be a part of that as they try to get better defensively in the AFC East. And so it's going to be fun to monitor his career with the Dolphins.
Well, those were the only two guys that heard their names called, but as expected, there were plenty of guys that got calls right after the draft. There's a whole list of guys that we thought would potentially get calls. It turns out 6 of them end up getting the calls from other teams. Of course, the Minnesota Vikings, they get 2 guys, Miles Dorn and Jake Bargas. Bargas being a little bit of a shock, a guy that really, if you look at the stat sheet, didn't have the type of career that I think a lot of people expected, but really turned into a great blocker at the end of his career, was the Tar Heels' best blocking tight end this past year, and now gets a chance to go up to a spot in Minnesota where they love to run the football, so it feels like he's going to fit in well there. Of course, Antonio Williams ends up going to the Buffalo Bills, another spot where it looks like he may actually have a chance to make that roster if he's able to open some eyes up there, and they did draft a running back in Zach Moss, but still some questions in that backfield behind their starter Devin Singletary, so you never really know there. Dominique Ross goes to the New York Giants. That was a big addition for him to be able to get onto a roster that is looking to add some linebacker depth. So they didn't really address it too much in the draft itself. Only selected 1 linebacker in the draft. Believe me, as a Giant fan, that did not make me very happy. But the good news is that they did sign some other guys after the draft was over, and Dominique Ross feels like that type of guy that just has enough versatility where you never really do know if he gets in there, he might be able to land. And then of course, one of the other guys that we expected would get a job, but some people maybe didn't, was Aaron Crawford. He ends up with the Baltimore Ravens, and that really just feels like a perfect fit for him, going to a place close to his home and a place where you feel like he's going to be able to have some sort of effect. Is there one guy maybe that sticks out to you the most out of that group that you think might be able to come in and have a big impact?
Well, I think you spoke right there, being Aaron Crawford. The fit is phenomenal. Baltimore, which, by the way, stellar draft, and you're able to get a guy that graded out as Pro Football's Focus best graded run defender from last year as an undrafted free agent. And we all know what they did last year, and a lot of talks about Lamar Jackson. That defense is still very good. He's going to join a group that will push him to get better. And then you talked about Minnesota, Miles Dorn getting drafted, and Jake Bargas, like you said. Not a whole lot of a great guy to be in the receiving, but he's a hell of a blocking tight end. And they're an old-school team. They want to line up and shove the ball down your throat, but they do it with 3 tight end sets. He could be one that no one thought could find a way on an NFL roster, but he could be a guy that he's, as you said, so good in run blocking, could very much find himself playing up on Sundays. And then I like Antonio Williams having a chance to make the roster in Buffalo. As you said, they've got a lot of questions after Devin Singletary in that backfield. We know he's going to work hard. He's got to get a little bit faster, a little bit leaner, but I feel like he could be a guy, if he's on an NFL roster come September, won't be surprised.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that there's a good chance for Dominique Ross as well. Like I said, the Giants are looking for a ton of guys at linebacker because they didn't really address the need in the draft, and that's a position where last year they just really didn't – they didn't address it most of the year, and they haven't done a ton of that in free agency either. They really just need depth. They're not looking for guys that can come in and start. I feel like that situation sets up for them very well. Miles Dorn, there was a guy that writes for one of their blog sites up in Minnesota, and he told me that he thinks that Miles Dorn is better than the safety that they drafted in the draft. Now, that's saying something because I thought that the Minnesota Vikings had one of the best drafts out of anybody, but still, I think that he has a very legitimate chance to make that roster. I feel like if he had gotten invited to the Combine, he probably would have been drafted. Not getting invited to the Combine, I think, really hurt him in terms of his draft stock, which, again, you can kind of take what you want to from that. I think that's kind of a bad reason to not draft somebody. I mean, if it makes sense for him to, on tape be drafted, I don't understand why not getting an invite to the Combine should keep you from getting drafted. But ultimately, I think we're in agreement. Aaron Crawford is a guy that I just could not understand how they did not have him on draft boards. It made absolutely no sense. That's my favorite stat from any player from a year ago. He graded out as Pro Football Focus's best interior lineman in terms of run stopping. And that's not a fluke stat. You could say whatever you want about Pro Football Focus. They've done a fantastic job there, and it really is one of the better sites that I've seen in terms of the different grades that they give out in determining the value of players. So I think he's got a chance up there. The only thing that I worry about with that is just how much talent is already up there in Baltimore, because right now that's a team that is probably seen as the biggest threat to Kansas City, and maybe not only in the AFC, but maybe in the NFL period. So we'll see how that all works out. The interesting thing that we also saw last night was right after the draft was over, of course, some of these guys like to put out their 2021 prospects rankings. The ones that are on it the most, of course, is the Draft Network, and they were already throwing up some of their ratings for the 2021 class in terms of draftees. A lot of Tar Heel fans, I put out the rankings earlier today for people to look at, and there were a lot of people that were a little bit angry. So I'll read you off some of these ones here, and then we'll talk about them just really quick. Chaz Surratt is the highest rated guy on the big board, rated as the number 77 overall guy, which would mean he'd be around the third rounder. And then you've got him as the number 9 linebacker. So as we expected, he was going to be very highly rated, very flexible guy that can go out in coverage if needed. Of course, late in the year, as we saw, sort of adjusted to his role as an inside linebacker and became the team's best tackler, and it wasn't, frankly, really even close. Then you have Michael Carter. He's rated as the number 160 overall prospect, so right on the edge of being a 4th or 5th round guy, rated as the number 13 running back in the class. And honestly, I'm going to be real. I'm kind of shocked that he is that high. I know he had a 1,000-yard rushing season a year ago, but it feels like most of the time the guys that play in backfields where you have two really good backs like that, they kind of drop a little bit. But he definitely brings some receiving value. He's the type of running back that we thought, he's starting to show signs that he can be the type of running back that we thought he was going to be, where we compared him to Gio Bernard. So it'll be interesting to see if he stays there or if he's able to move up. But then the ones that I think a lot of people were really talking about, and the ones that I think we're going to focus on, you got De'Ami Brown as the number 222 overall player, so a 7th round guy, rated as the number 30 wide receiver. And then you got Daz Newsome as the number 259 overall, so probably undrafted, but could be a late selection in the 7th round, and the number 34 overall wide receiver. Now, before we get into this, we do want to preface that just from looking at the guys that are on the board ahead of them, this is another loaded wide receiving class. And Matt Miller, who does a great job over at Bleacher Report, he said that he believes this class may be better than the class that we just saw in this 2020 draft, which they said was the best ever. I know that you've probably got some issues with those guys being that low, especially after what we saw from them last year, both guys going over 1,000 yards receiving. But ultimately, what's your reaction to what we must also tell people, and hopefully they realize it, is an extremely early 2021 big board from the Draft Network?
Yeah, look, I would be lying if I said I looked in where I saw Diami and Daz and say I wasn't shocked because I thought they'd be a little bit higher. Because I thought they should be a little bit higher, but then again, I watch those guys every Saturday. The 30 guys ahead of them, I don't see but maybe a handful of times, especially the ones from the big-time schools. But like you said, it is April of 2020. We've got a whole other year for those rankings to change. And also, as we were talking in the pre-production meeting, not all those guys are going to go to the NFL, so the ability for them to climb will be there. And also, you put another 1,000 yards up on your film, you're going to go up the draft boards. If Daz Newsome eliminates his drops, he'll climb. A lot of people consider him the number one receiver going in to the college football season, despite the drop issues he had last year. So, look, it's very premature. We were talking the other night during the draft about how Carolina, first 2 days weren't putting anyone on the draft boards. I think that's going to change when you look at what Mac Brown's already doing, the talent that's coming in. It won't be too long before we're going to be sitting on draft night seeing guys get drafted in the first round, at the very minimum the second round on. So I think Chaz Surratt's very interesting because if he puts another year like that on film, he's kind of our version, I guess, of Isaiah Simmons, the guy that can do all kind of things. Not saying he'll go top 10 in the draft and that he's that caliber player, but that's kind of what you relate him to. Michael Carter, I'm with you. Probably a little highly rated than I would have thought. I look at him as a poor man's Dalvin Cook, but you run for 1,000 yards again, splitting time in the backfield, people are still going to look at you as being productive with limited carries. So it's interesting. It's good to see our fans engaging in NFL draft talk for a draft that's still a year away. And just, we all know Sam Howell was a quarterback prospect. He's been the number one prospect on the board, so that's all that really matters.
Oh, you wait till that 2022 early draft board comes out this time next year. People will be losing it over where he is at on that board. I think, with Chaz Surratt, it's very interesting because you got to think that just a year ago at this time, we were thinking this guy might be our number 3 guy, a third string on the depth chart at middle linebacker or outside linebacker. Now we're talking about him as the best prospect in terms of Tar Heel players on the board for the 2021 draft. I like that. That's an interesting comparison for Michael Carter. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't really done a whole lot of thinking about that. That is kind of interesting. I don't think he runs quite with as fierce of an edge as Dalvin Cook does, but that's an interesting comparison for him, and I think there's a lot to like about him. And then there's a couple other guys, that I think are going to probably end up getting on there. Who do you think maybe is that guy that we haven't talked about yet that could end up being on that board? I know one guy that I'm kind of shocked isn't on there anywhere. Is there someone that you think is maybe being slept on a little bit?
You just threw me for a loop because in this pre-production meeting, that was not on the topics of discussion.
Okay, it's just a reactionary thing. I hadn't thought about it either until we started talking about this. So just let's calm down here. We've got plenty of time. What do we got? We got the Last Dance documentary coming up, but we're not going to spend too long here on talking about the upcoming season. So what do you think? Is there a guy maybe that you think we should be talking about?
Simone Fox.
Okay. That's an interesting one. I like his size. I like his position flexibility as well. And I think he'll probably I don't want to go this bold because I've tried saying this the last couple of years and nobody's reached that number. He could reach double-digit sacks if he's able to build on what we saw him do last year. And when we say build, we're really focusing on building that consistency that he just hasn't really had his first few years and put all those flashes together. The guy that I'm kind of shocked is nowhere on there is Javonte Williams, because he kind of does everything that you want in a modern running back. He runs hard. He's a guy that has good, not great, top-end speed. So if you need to run him outside on the edges, he still has the ability to do that. But the other thing that he does that just doesn't get enough, that he doesn't get enough credit for, is he can catch the ball out of the backfield. And I feel like that's the thing that you've got to be able to do as a running back in this day and age, or else you just are not going to make the NFL. You have to have some sort of receiving background. You have to be able to do something with the football in your hands, not only when you get carries, but when you're out there running routes. And then he's also not a bad pass protector. So I don't know if he's a guy that's going to go early. I think he'll probably end up staying 4 years. But ultimately, I think that if he has a really good season, don't be surprised if he's a name that suddenly shows up on some of those boards. So let's move on, talk a little bit about this upcoming season. I know there's still a lot of uncertainty around everything that's going on. And again, we want to preface this by saying that we are not experts. We have no clue what is going to happen in terms of this upcoming season. Everything that we've heard is the same stuff that you guys are hearing. We have not talked to CDC experts. We have not talked to the President of the United States, though at this point, we don't really know what that would do for us. We don't know anything more than you guys know. We're just kind of speculating, but we've heard the rumors that if they were to have to move the season, they would probably end up moving it into the spring. Now, there's a couple of different things that sort of come up with that, and that is more than likely when they would have to start the season would be during college basketball season. Most people are kind of pinpointing a February timeline as to when they would start playing what would most likely only be conference games. Now, I know you've had a little bit of pushback on this. What is the reasoning behind why you're saying that they shouldn't play in the spring?
Well, the thing is that if you move it to the spring, let's just talk logistically. How are you going to justify them then turning around in less than 5 or 6 months and playing a full season? Everything we're doing now in the football world is trying to make the game safer, so we're limiting injuries, mainly concussions. Well, if you play them a full schedule, and then you talk about the playoff games, stuff like that, you get up into 14, 15 games, and that starts in February. That's probably going to end around April. You got to think about, in less than 3 months, they're going to be back on campus, then getting prepared for the fall. To me, that sends the wrong message. What about the guys that would be going into that year's draft, which would happen in literally right after the season ended? How many of those guys would you see just sit out because they're not going to risk jeopardizing their NFL careers for playing 12 college football games because their season had to get moved because of the COVID-19 virus? And then you get to the more logistical things. How are you going to juggle TV contracts during the NFL or during the college basketball and NBA seasons? There's just so many different things that you're going to have to take into effect if you move the season. Now, look, if that's what they got to do to play the season, sign me up. This is supposed to be one of the biggest years for Carolina football in recent memory. I'm on board with whatever it takes to play the year, see how the year plays out. But I'm also more in favor of, I'm looking at an article right now, whether we got to reduce the schedule to play all ACC games, okay, right. I'm okay with that. Or if you got to play in front of an empty stadium, I know it would be different because the thing we talk about with college football is how the environment makes the game what it is. I'm an NFL guy through and through, but the college football environment is what makes college football so special. But if that's what we got to do to have the year, I'm on board with that. I think the thing is that when it all comes down to is money. And other people are going to get mad about that. Right. But we're already seeing without their revenue, so many other sports across campus are going to be eliminated because that's how they are paid for. So I want the season to be played so that way all these other athletes can still pursue their dreams and more importantly, get an education. decide something by the summer at the latest, you'd imagine.
Right.
Because you're not going to tell them in August we're going to play football in September.
Yeah, I think your spot. I mean, you bring up some really great points. You talked about the point why, in my mind, they're going to have no choice but to play in the spring if they can't play in the fall. Football brings in the most revenue on any campus. I don't care what anybody says. I don't care if you think that there's a sport on your campus that is better. Unless you play in a football stadium that seats maybe 10,000 and your basketball stadium, you're wherever you play basketball, whether it's an arena or if you play somewhere, on campus, wherever, there's no way that you can live without having football on your campus in terms of keeping your other sports up and running. And we're not talking about, well, you would lose basketball, probably even baseball. Most baseball teams would probably stay around. Most people are going to be like, well, who honestly really cares if we lose sports like soccer, sports like lacrosse, sports like tennis, stuff like that. Now, for Carolina fans, I think it's a little bit different because, look, we've seen so much success. We've grown close to even those athletes because we talk about the Tar Heel family. And when we talk about it, it's not just the Tar Heel family in the major sports. It's all sports. You have connections to every sport because we have had so much success. But at the other schools, you've got to realize that some of these kids are coming from across country to play sports for schools that, they know they're signing up and signing scholarships for sports that don't bring in money. For them, how are you going to turn around and tell these kids, hey, we have to drop your scholarship and you're probably not going to be going to school here because we don't have enough room for you on campus because your sport just got dropped. We didn't have enough money to keep your sport up and going. That's what people have to realize. And I know juggling with college basketball is definitely going to be tough. It would only be for 1 year. That's the good news on that front. And in terms of what are they going to do about the guys that would have to play next fall, it's a tricky situation. I mean, honestly, what you would have to do is pretty much leave it up to the guys as to whether or not they want to play. And most of the guys, I think, are going to say yes. Now, there is a group of guys that would say no. And I think Carolina is one of those teams that would be in a relatively good scenario because I feel like most of the guys would still want to play. The guys that are going to say no would be the guys that have great draft stock, don't really need this season to vault them into the top the top 10. Most guys probably within the first round or two probably wouldn't even play this year. But I mean, when you talk about like Trevor Lawrence, if he has a chance to go to the NFL next season, which he does, he will not, if the season gets moved to the spring, I am willing to bet just about everything that I have that he will not play in the upcoming college football season if it's played in the spring. That's where teams are going to have a little bit of hesitancy. Now, for Clemson, they shouldn't really. It shouldn't really be that big of a deal because you're going to have to find a way to replace him anyways down the line. You'll just have to do it a little bit earlier. But I think you mentioned canceling conference game or out of conference games. I think that's something that's a very realistic possibility, whether they play it in the fall or in the spring. From what I've seen, if they play it in the spring, that's going to happen without a doubt. But I think that it's going to be talked about a lot because of the money situation. You're ultimately probably going to have no choice but to choose. If you end up wanting to play, then that's fine. You're going to have to realize that you're probably going to be playing 2 full seasons in the span of about 8 months. And it'll be interesting to see how many guys choose to sign up for that. I think there still will be a lot of guys that would be in for that. But if they're not, we're going to really find out how deep some of these teams are. And we're not just talking about Carolina. We're talking about some of the best teams in the country. You'll see a lot of guys at Clemson that could potentially sit out. We're going to see guys that maybe didn't think they were going to have to play that early get a chance to play earlier. It'll definitely be very interesting. And, of course, we'll be keeping you up to date on everything that's going on with the coach COVID-19 virus in terms of how it will affect Carolina's upcoming 2020 season as we grow a little bit closer. But I think right now we're going to get ready to lock it down. Last Dance is coming on, so we want to make sure that we're in position and ready for that. And also, we're still somehow waiting on the basketball side for Kerwin Walton to commit. At this point, I have no idea. I think we have a better chance of seeing this 2020 football season go off than we have of seeing him commit at this point. This is just getting unbelievable. But we'll have you covered with all that. HeelToughBlog.com is where you guys can go and check it out. We've had you covered with everything going on with the Kerwin Walton recruitment over on the basketball side of things, as well as we've done some player reviews for the 2019-20 season. Also, we had you covered for the NFL draft. We got a breakdown of the positions where the guys went and their fits in their new places as well. So make sure you guys go back and check that out. Those are some that's a really interesting article. And then, of course, we got some stuff coming out in terms of recruiting. We'll have the biggest needs article. That's going to come out probably tomorrow, as long as Kerwin Walton doesn't decide to delay his decision another day. But that'll be up there for you guys to look at as well as some other great stuff that we'll be doing as we grow closer to the season. So the last thing I want to make sure that you guys do, make sure you rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. The rate and review part will help us move up some of the rankings on some of the major podcasting sites. We'd really appreciate that, not just for us, but mainly for the people out there that don't know about the podcast, that search Tar Heel Podcast, and we're not really showing up there. We want to be able to move up those rankings so that people can see it and be able to subscribe to the podcast, just like we hope you do, so that you don't miss an episode of the podcast. We got so many other great interviews coming up with former Tar Heel players, and of course, as we get closer and closer to the season, we'll be doing so many more podcasts, and we'll also be keeping you up to date on everything that's going on in terms of Tar Heel football recruiting. So once again, want to thank Josh Marlowe for being with me tonight. Want to thank you guys for listening to this edition of the podcast, and as always, go Tar Heels!